The hotel scenes of the Velvet Paw of Asquith novels, also known as the Duvin books, by Thomas Caulfield. Read by the author. Consider a world inhabited with only cats and dogs. A society recognisable as our own, but with its eccentricities being the norm, rather than the exception. A world where the charm of Kenneth Grahame's Wind in the Willows meets the exotic world of Ian Fleming's Bond. A world where Fluffy just got dangerous. These are the Velvet Paw of Asquith novels, also known as the Duvin books. Welcome to the genre of new fable. The books follow Oscar Teabag Duvin, a secret agent who believes he's more a poet than a spy, in a series of international jet-setting adventures involving greed, espionage, and the odd foray into professional cheese shaping. Unfolding with a gratuitousness only possible in a world unrestrained by conventional society, the Velvet Paw of Asquith novels take the word mystery far too literally, and the word intrigue not literally enough. Despite finding training to be brash and clinical with too much shouting and not enough singing, Oscar battles villains while trying to thwart their garish plans. But thwarting isn't easy when unable to do much more than rhyme one lot of words with another. Nevertheless, he succeeds with the help of the characters he meets and a courage that arises the moment he believes it cannot. One of the recurring themes in the Velvet Paw of Asquith novels are their absurd hotel scenes. There are lots of hotels in the Velvet Paw of Asquith novels because their adventures are international and quite tiring. Whether it be irritating concierges, snobby waiters, or patrons hard-pressed to determine whether the dining room's meals are chicken or fish, the hotel scenes have become iconic in the Duvin books. Here then is a collection of such scenes for your digestion. Chapter 1. From The Purging of Ruen, Chapter 13, in which Oscar returns from a day of traipsing around the beautiful seaside city of Ruen, only to find the hotel he's been staying at has been cordoned off in preparation for an exclusive dinner for the city's councillors. Oscar frowned at a sign in Hotel de Ruen's foyer. It wasn't a complicated sign, nor was it confusing. It only had 6 words, and 3 of them were one syllable. He frowned because he was thinking about things that were complicated. His bizarre conversation with a cycloptic dog, and a freak encounter with a manure-smearing cat. The former hinted at something unruly brewing, while the latter provided an illustrated example. The sign wasn't helping him understand either. Instead, it highlighted his day's frustration. He'd spent most of it perusing cafes, all of which had made excellent hot fin, but offered no further curiosities. In them, he deliberated his options, which ultimately revolved around perusing more cafes. He'd asked waiters about poo-smearing animals and nasty things brewing, which they took as criticism of their cafes. As a result, he'd been thrown out of them, which was another reason for the number of venues frequented. After such an unconstructive and indiscreet day, Oscar felt about as useful as a bucket with no bottom, and he couldn't recall any catacombs training regarding bottomless buckets. The manure scrawling had been rinsed away, and its author was even less famous than one of his poems. Were it not for the audience who'd seen the graffiti, he might have dismissed the encounter as dream. Moreover, a day spent wandering through Ruen hadn't revealed anything to illustrate Horace's concerns either. Indeed, the place seemed wonderful, particularly if one aspired to being thrown from cafes. He felt to have pieces of puzzle from completely different puzzles. He was keen to throw them back in their boxes and go home, but he was on Curiosa, so he couldn't. Regardless, he didn't have the boxes. Instead, he continued glowering at the sign. He wondered whether visiting Horace might result in more clues, but felt the dog had already divulged more than intended. He could admit to being a Velvet Paw of Asquith, perhaps, but because that would be about as discreet as wiping feces on a wall, He refrained. Disheartened, he realised that tomorrow he'd probably just visit more cafes. He read the sign again. Dining room closed for private function. He scowled. It might as well be referring to his competence, except that he hadn't any. After a day of being useless, he'd been looking forward to another excellent meal of food to compensate. "Are you having trouble with it, sir?" a staff member asked. "I'm sorry?" "The sign," the animal said, pointing at it. "Are you having trouble with any bit of it in particular?" "Trouble?" "Yes, it's just that you've been staring at it for some time, and I was wondering what bit of it you're struggling with." "I'm not struggling with any of it, thank you," Oscar said, not in the mood for convivial hoteliers. Not with the sign, anyway. "Are you certain? You've been looking at it for quite some time." "I was thinking about something else." "In relation to the sign?" "What?" "What are your thoughts in relation to the sign, perhaps?" "Are you trying to be annoying?" "No, not at all," the animal assured him. "It's my job to ensure that things at Hotel Ruen run smoothly. Here, let me help you." He proceeded to read the sign aloud, stopping at each word and peering at Oscar to ensure he understood. "I can read perfectly well," Oscar said. "I'm just disappointed that I can't dine here tonight." "So your thoughts were in relation to the sign?" "No," said Oscar patiently. "The comment was an adjunct to your recital, not an explanation for its need." The animal stared at him. Fed up, Oscar said, "One of those words is very badly misspelt. Can you tell which one?" When the animal gasped and perused the sign with the sort of avidity often attributed to bestsellers, Oscar strode to the lift in annoyance. After it pinged, he got in and rose 2 floors to alight no more appeased. He trudged along the hallway, muttering things about signs that are muttered for a reason. Once in his room, he stood as he had 2 floors lower, still bereft of ideas. The peculiar limbo of arrival returned, its potency even greater than upon his arrival. He wandered to the window, leant against its sill and slumped a chin upon paw. Purple shadows of evening had grown long, and beneath them couples strolled along the foreshore. Waves crashed in thump and hissed in retreat, leaving him with that strange relief from immediacy that dozing affords. Encumbered and shackled, I'm weary in wait, afternoons spent in a peculiar state. For betwixt the hours I did try to discern, yet arrive home with nothing, for nil have I earned. The verse took him by surprise, and when he sat up to recall it, found that he was unable to. Not that it mattered, as he had little inclination to write it down. On the street below, blue strobes lit its darkness, and grew brighter until becoming a blur of flashes. He leaned out the window to see police cars arrive and mount the pavement. From them, officers alighted. Some began cordoning off the street, while others ran around their vehicles until they got dizzy and fell over. It was peculiar behaviour, which he watched until interrupted by a knock at his door. Opening it, he was greeted by 2 police officers. Both of them stared at the top of his head. "Are you alone, sir?" one asked it. Oscar nodded. "May we peruse your room for reasons of security?" "I'm sorry, what?" "Your room," the second one said, still intrigued with his head. "May we peruse it for reasons of security?" Indignant at having his missing ears addressed, Oscar said, "In what way could repeating the question possibly serve as explanation?" "What?" He folded his paws. "If it is apparent that I have no idea what you're talking about," he said, "how can asking the same question after rearranging only 2 of its words possibly improve my chances of grasping it?" The officers glanced at each other, unconvinced that hotel security sweeps involved giving comprehension lessons to strange cats with peculiar heads. "We were being polite," the first said. "What?" said Oscar, wondering if this might go on all night. "We were being polite. It was made to sound like a request, even though it wasn't one." "Oh. Now get out of our way so we can search your room." They were big and strong, so Oscar stepped aside. They checked his room very badly, under the mattress and behind curtains, with one taking far too long perusing a waste paper basket, considering it was empty. He watched them with growing bewilderment, convinced that having no crime to fight left them in dire need of some. When he asked what all the fuss was about, they explained that the hotel was hosting an important private function and that they had to check for things. Waste paper, presumably. When inquiring as to who the guests were, he was told that it was none of his business, which Oscar admitted being the reason behind asking. The officers, however, didn't care. When their search was complete, despite it being nothing of the sort, they thanked his missing ears and left. Intrigued, Oscar decided to have a look downstairs. He fluffed his pantaloons and donned a smart blue scarf before attempting to spike his fur into makeshift ears. The mirror suggested it worked on one side, though only from a distance, provided he didn't turn his head. It was impossible to get the spikes symmetrical, however, so he was left looking even more bizarre than when earless. He sighed, flattened his fur, and wondered whether he should wear a sign that read, "I know." Downstairs, the dining room had been cordoned off, as had half the foyer, and guests were being shuttled from both in a manner bordering on deportation. Apart from a cluster of staff leafing through dictionaries beside the sign, the place no longer resembled a hotel foyer, looking instead like one of the early rehearsals from What the Fluff Are We Doing, the musical. Caught in the tide of extradition, Oscar was bustled from the place to discover that things were worse outside. Rather than a coordinated security sweep, it was more an overreaction of astonishing proportions, which left him staring with a sort of clinical disbelief. Police were everywhere. Their cars, flashing and bleating, filled both street and pavement. Among them, officers hurried, escorting guests and spectators in a manner that was clearly non-negotiable. Police vans arrived and squeezed between cars until side mirrors broke and doors bent, which forced officers in them to extricate themselves through windows. A lamppost was backed into, which teetered before falling onto a van. Its driver began sobbing when unable to release her seatbelt. Several officers hurried to her, some of which became overwhelmed themselves and accompanied her wails with an admirable chorus of their own. Oscar was pushed aside when police hurried up the hotel steps, clutching huge rolls of cordoning tape, which they unleashed in a manner suggesting they intended to mummify the place. Several tried cordoning anything they could get their paws on, including each other, which resulted in some of the more severely tangled being forced to congregate on the pavement and wait for scissors. He was jostled again by several officers bounding down the steps who pointed at things while talking into radios, and then by others bounding up them who talked into radios while pointing at things. He was forced aside altogether when the foyer's pot plants were dragged down the steps, interrogated, and then arrested for loitering. It looked like a bizarre crime scene, bereft of any crime. "Move along, there's nothing to see here." He turned to see another officer addressing his missing ears. "Tell me," said Oscar, his indignation bordering on criminal, "do they teach you discretion particularly early in your training?" "I'm sorry?" the officer said, glancing at him in a more traditional manner. Oscar doubted he was sorry at all, and ignored him, which was appropriate considering the air above his head had been addressed rather than anything below it. "I said move along, there's nothing to see here." When a police car backed into another one, mounted its bonnet and set off its sirens, Oscar looked at him in a manner suggesting he might like to retract the statement. "Nevertheless," the officer said, "no animal is to remain in the vicinity of the hotel this evening." "I presume that's to keep casualties to a minimum," said Oscar. An observation illustrated when a police van backed over a second one, forcing the driver to arrest himself. Muttering in irritation, the officer hurried away to cordon both. An argument erupted further up the street, where a police car had become wedged on the pavement after attempting to avoid becoming wedged on the pavement. Several officers tried lifting the vehicle. When unsuccessful, they decided to use a second car to drag the first free. It might have worked had the officer driving remembered to disengage reverse. He hadn't, which resulted in the second being backed into the first before being shoved halfway up a telegraph pole. While blame was appointed, a third police car arrived and tried squeezing past the first two. When forced to mount the pavement, blame apportioning was suspended, as pavement mounting had been responsible for the problem in the first place. Although it managed to scrape past, it lost a door and 2 hubcaps in the process, which resulted in a small round of applause and a frantic issuing of traffic infringement notices between everyone. At the street's other end, an officer had locked his keys in a car, which was apparent when a senior animal began shouting at him and gesticulating wildly. When the first began sobbing, the gesticulations became even more avid and were accompanied by assurances that if the car wasn't moved immediately, neither of them would have to worry about keys or gesticulations, wild or otherwise, for much longer. In a bid for reprieve, the sobbing officer pulled out his baton and smashed the car's window. Although this afforded acquisition of the keys, it set off the vehicle's alarm. This left the senior animal even more furious and his gesticulations bordering on epileptic, especially when the first refused to get into the car because the glass might hurt his bottom. While Oscar stared at the charade, a fire hydrant exploded and some furniture fell out of a window in the building across the street. How Ruen managed a non-existent crime rate with police like this was beyond him. It seemed that Ruen ought to import a few criminals just to give the poor creatures something to work with.